Soy encantado de hablar ahora con Edwidge Candicat. We'll speak in English, right, Edwidge?
Yes.
I think we'll speak in English, pero muchísimas gracias. Le agradezco esto. Muchísimas gracias a Rosa Ferre y a todo el equipo de su centro cultural. So, Edwidge, it's a real pleasure to talk to you. It's like an unending conversation I think we have had over probably nearly 2 decades. Many things I think bring us together. And today, I would like to start this conversation by reading something, reading a poem that I believe means a lot to you and has meant a lot to me, and which I've used and quoted and cited throughout this moment, this delirious moment we're living through of the pandemic. It's a poem by a young poet called Warsan Shire, and she's a Somali poet. And I will read an extract from this poem and ask you to react. This as a way of initiating our conversation, both on immigration, on danger, on refugees, and on so much else. And this is how the poem begins, and then I'll skip through it because it's quite a long and very ferocious poem, which I think everybody must read today after our conversations. It's called Home. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well. A bit later on, you have to understand that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. No one burns their palms under trains beneath carriages. No one spends days and nights in the stomach of a truck feeding on newspaper unless the miles traveled means something more than journey. No one crawls under fences. No one wants to be beaten, pitied. And she ends the poem by saying, no one leaves home until home is a sweaty voice in your ear saying, leave, run away from me now. I don't know what I've become, but I know that anywhere is safer than here. Edwidge, hearing these words that you know well, in the moment we find ourselves, which is a moment which comes again and again and again, it seems it's, you know, like a minstrel show. I wonder how it resonates with you at this moment on October 15th at 1:30 p.m. in Miami.
Well, I want to say buenas tardes, everybody. Muchas gracias. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Paul. For me, it's those words I've been repeating to myself so many times, and actually they started. I started seeing them a lot at protests initially, like on pro-immigration protests throughout the United States. The last 4 or 5 years. And of course, Warsan Shire is a brilliant poet, but sometimes, we have artists that give us some words that really speak to the moment. And that's one of them, certainly for me as an immigrant who came to the US when I was 12 years old from a family of immigrants who have different types of immigration status. And I think we're also, we're living in a world now that, the UN had a statistic that there's about 65 million people in the world who are stateless right now. And if there were a nation, they would be the 5th largest nation in the world. So I think we have to start thinking of migration and in these much more compassionate way, in this more compelling way, from the point of view of the people who are migrating and the really very difficult choices that they're making.
And I I can't but start to think of the painful images we are seeing day in, day out, which for you are much more than just images, of the Haitian refugees. And the Haitian refugees, particularly those trying to cross the borders of the country we both have chosen to live in.
Mm-hmm. Well, and absolutely. Sorry, go ahead.
No.
Oh no, but I was going to say before rudely interrupting you. I think that I see those images, of course, like in a very personal way, because that could be my mother, that could be my father. But I think we also have to see them in a continuum, right? And also they're, we're shown only Haitian refugees, but that border has seen so many migrants from all over the world, just like Europe has been seeing so many migrants from different parts of the world, and sometimes we concentrate on a particular group because that might be the group that can be used most politically because of racism, because of other issues. But on that border, there are migrants from all over the world who are coming through, along with the Haitian migrants, and the images are harrowing, of course. And for us, for those of us who are from that community, who are live on the other side of the border, it's extraordinarily painful.
I'm wondering how we can think of a better language to discuss refugees, because I think to a large extent, and I think Warsan Shire addresses that in some way, that the language around refugees is a pernicious language, a very divisive language. And I'm wondering how we can recalibrate it, precisely so that we understand that the people crossing are perhaps who we were 2 or 3 generations ago and have forgotten.
Well, I mean, I think that's really part of one of the most powerful role of artists, right? In general, is giving us another language. And I think as the children of immigrants, as the potential relative of, the relative of asylum seekers, a family member of refugees, for me, I see the language of potential. I think in the general conversation, whether it's in Europe or in the United States and elsewhere, we're usually offered up this language of, this invasion force, right? And sometimes, we're in the age of a pandemic. So you throw in a kind of like this notion of this diseased horde that's coming to take over the land. But I think on the other side, as people who have had that experience, who are the product really of migration, we see the potential. We see it as potential, and people, I think it was. Someone said, like, you wanted workers, you got people, in migration. I think it was Fritz or someone like that who said it. And the people come with families and want to work hard, have a lot of dreams that they want to live through. They want to contribute to the places where they end up, and so I think that would be the shift. And also individualizing, right? Like, it's a person, it's a mother, it's a father, it's a child, it's someone's beloved, right? And to shift that conversation towards, the stigmatization, the generalization towards, like, I'm just like you, just like you, like your mother, like your father, or as you were saying, to dig back into our own history of migration.
Yeah, no one puts their child. I mean, I think that's what's so powerful of Warsan Shire, is that anybody reading that poem with any level of compassion understands that you don't put your child in harm's way. And hearing you reminded me of a poem that I'm sure you're very well aware of Gwendolyn Brooks, where she says, "We are each other's harvest, we are each other's business, we are each other's magnitude and bond."
Yeah.
And bond, and how does that fit into what you've been saying?
Well, again, I think the poets, they give us that language, and I think art is about dreaming, and sometimes it feels like impossible dreaming, like unreasonable dreaming, but artists are dreamers, and part of our role is to be able to dream of a better society. And I remember I had this.
It reminds me of Seamus Heaney, who said, "Walk on air against your better judgment." Anyway, you were saying.
Yes. But the thing is, a lot of artists are, a lot of people who are coming are walking on water, right? Like they're coming by water. So that a couple of years ago, I remember a friend, Patricia Engel, wrote a novel in which there's a conversation between an immigrant parent and child. And then the child ends up saying the father says to the daughter, "You don't need to be an artist because immigrants are artists," right? Because we are creating something from a dream. We're creating something, we're trying to create something amorphous, like something concrete from something amorphous. You're going somewhere where you don't know exactly what you're going to find. And it's the same way that an artist, faces a blank page or a blank canvas. So there is that sort of correlation between art and immigration. It's like both the immigrant and the artist, share that sort of like that risk-taking, that so like facing the unknown to try to create something better, something beautiful, something promising with potential.
The word, I was going to ask you something completely different, but I have to react to what you just said, because the word risk that you used is, I think, so central in a way to your thinking, and in some way was prompted by the book that the introduction mentioned, which is really a whole thought process in Albert Camus about writing really, as Brecht might have said, in dark times. And I'm wondering, as you think about this moment, and you think about how to write in a moment of risk and trying to balance the advocacy that you've often been placed to do, to speak for a nation, to speak for its misery, to speak for its hopes and dreams, and at the same time, a reflective moment you need to think through the crisis. So the risk-taking is writing about the danger, and the need you also have as a witness, which is something I want to come back to later, to sort of move yourself back so that you can look at what is in front of you.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've talked about this before, where I love Albert Camus gave right before he died this lecture on L'artiste et son temps, which was translated as Create Dangerously, which I ponder on for my own reflections, because I grew up in Haiti during the time of the dictatorship, and a lot of the artists and the writers that I adored, that I eventually ended up wanting to emulate, had to go into exile. Some of them were killed for their work, and so there was the sense of really concrete, obvious, risk, and people would have to hide their books. They'd had to burn their books because if you were caught with the wrong book, you could, it could mean like wiping out your whole family. And there was actually a writer, Marie-Vieux Chauvet, who would get together with a group of artists, and they call themselves the Spiders of the Night. And they met and read each other poems during the dictatorship, which was a very brave act. So for me, like I feel like with that legacy, it's always nudging me a little bit to try to keep in mind what a lot of artists have to go through to create their work. And Camus also had this notion in that same essay that every artist has a couple of events in which their art and their heart first opened, right? And then you sort of carry those events, like those 2 or 3 events, around with you your whole life, and are trying to better understand them. And in many ways, there'll be moments where they intersect with other people, because we're often, probably all human beings, are walking around with a series of experiences that mark us, that change us. And artists just have, we just have writers, painters, musicians, others. We just have a way to ruminate with it over time as witnesses, and also, I guess, as purveyors of our emotions and thoughts and feelings as well.
What would those 2 moments be for you?
For me, and I described it a little bit in the book, one was definitely, was related to migration. And there's so many now in the visibility of migration, like when you see people migrating, they're holding their children often. And the world was shocked by that one Syrian boy, that image of the boy on the shore. So children are much more visible in migration because their parents are not leaving them behind. But in my case, my parents left me with family members in Haiti because they believed it was safer and it was easier for them to work. And so the first for me would be my separation from my mother. My father left Haiti when I was 2, so I don't remember his departure, but my mother, I remember going to the airport and I thought I was going with her. And then I was 4 when my mother left, and they had to pull me literally from her arms. So that was for me number one. And that moment, I realized also in the years that followed that you can love people from afar. I didn't realize that when I was, and then the stories my mother told me on the phone, and the way that, she tried to mother me from a distance, I think has a lot to do with my attempts at storytelling, of wanting to tell a story, of wanting to share the way that I had to with my parents, over the phone and in letters for many years. And the second was arriving in the United States at age 12 and trying to rejoin, to watch my family try to become a family again, because we had 2 siblings who were born in New York, and then the 2 of us, my brother and I, who were coming to New York to try to then repiece our families together. And the age in the 80s, when we landed, Haitians, we were the only group that by nationality was said to have AIDS, which was the first pandemic that I lived through, which made it, then so many people in our community were losing their jobs and kids were beating us in school. So it was a really jarring transition. So those 2, but then as I've gotten older, they shifted too. My parents dying also comes into that, those moments that are marking my life. So I think, as Camus said, they emerge, you have different experiences as time goes by, but I do find my work evolving around those like family, migration, which are intersectional, if you will, in the way that they marked me.
And we've spoken in the past about your mother and the extraordinary stories you tell about walking behind her. I could go on about that, and you certainly can evoke it. But I know this is a moment also of reflection and perhaps pain for you, of marking the anniversary of your mother's death. And I was thinking about how we carry people on, and I recently had the pleasure of speaking with a Palestinian-American poet, Naomi Shihab Nye, and she has a very short poem, which I just want to recite to you and have you react, perhaps in the context of your mother, but also in the context of what we carry on and what we carry with us. She says, "People don't pass away. They die, and then they stay."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, I think my mother certainly stayed, and I think everybody stays on some ways. There's a little piece that they leave with you. I've always thought, the way I think about it is that someone cannot have spent like 60, 70, 80, or even years or even minutes on this earth and not leave some element of themselves. You know, it's like what Toni Morrison, called rememory. And when she talks about it, it's very different than remembering. Rememory for her was like something that was here and it's no longer here, but in some way still exists in some form. Like even if a house is burned down, like when you walk by that space, like something there exists that is that house in some way. So I think there are just so many, you know, I have 2 daughters. So of course my mother continues through them and in the way that, you know, I think also in the African tradition, it's like people never really die. There's sort of, there's a continuum. And I personally feel like if you've lost someone, and so many of us, you know, so many of us have lost loved ones over this coronavirus period. You know, it's been a devastating period for so many. And during that period, we were denied rituals, right? I don't know what it was like in Spain. I mean, but in the United States, you know, if at the peak of that coronavirus period, you could not, you know, go into the hospital and hold your loved one's hand. I had the privilege of holding my mother's hand at the moment that she took her last breath. And it feels
so extraordinary, doesn't it feel extraordinary that you're even saying, I had the privilege of holding her hand, because you're contrasting it to what happened a year later.
Oh, no, I mean, there are so many people. I have a friend who lost both his parents, and he was not able to, you know, just basically was dropped them at the door and could not go and see them. And so many people didn't have those rituals. You couldn't go, you know, my neighbor passed away and I couldn't go and I couldn't hug her daughters who I've known for so long. And so I think these were all that idea of we had to devise certain rituals for ourselves. We had to attend funerals the way these wonderful people are attending this conversation, right? We had to mourn that way, with that distance, without being able to touch one another. So that idea of continuity, you know, that a life continues in some ways, I think is even a little more comforting at this time.
You know, on one of the quarantine tapes, this program I have, which you were on, I spoke with a doctor here who deals in palliative care in Los Angeles. Her name is Sunita Puri, and she spoke about those last moments when family members could not see their loved ones. And she has this moment, Edwidge, and I want everybody, if you have an opportunity to hearing it, it's worthwhile. Sunita talks about being on an iPad with a person dying, and they are speaking to someone who's just behind a glass door, a family member looking in. And the person dies, and when she looks up, the doctor looks up, all she sees is the shadow of a hand on the glass that should never have been there. And it's so powerful. It's so powerful also from the point of view not only of the family, but of the doctors. Who cannot bring together patients with their families. I want to shift a little bit here but in a way it includes so much of what we've already spoken about. It's something that you and I have spoken about quite a few times, which is the notion of ancestors. The notion of ancestors, the notion of where we come from, the notion of who we are because of all those people who preceded us, the ways in which you learned to write by listening, the ways in which the oral culture, the wisdom, as Lewis Hyde says, of what resides on the tongue. I've always loved that notion of wisdom on the tongue, the stories that were told to you. And you have this epigraph, which I must read at least once a month, that comes from Michael Ondaatje. I was sure you would know what it is, the epigraph to an extraordinary book of yours, which I encourage all our Spanish-speaking audience to read. I hope it's translated, and if not, just take a dictionary and read it in English. It's a book called The Art of Death, and in it you have this epigraph, which I'd love you to react to now. I think every time I talk to you, Edwidge, I'll have you react to this epigraph every 5 years. Michael Ondaatje in The English Patient writes, "We die containing a richness of lovers and tribes, tastes we have swallowed, bodies we have plunged into and swum up as if rivers of wisdom, characters we have climbed into as if trees, fears we have hidden in as if caves. I wish for all this to be marked on my body when I am dead. I believe in such a cartography, to be marked by nature, not just to label ourselves on a map, like the names of rich men and women on buildings. We are communal histories, communal books." How do you hear this now? I think it was such an extraordinary epigraph for you to put.
Well, I love that book so much. And as I'm sure some of the viewers do, and there's so many powerful reflections in there about war, about life, about death, about love. But that one really stuck with me, because when I first read it, I was like, me too. Like I wish for all this to be marked on my body when I'm dead. Of course, we have no control over what happens to our bodies when we're dead. But I thought, I just love, like, we are communal histories, communal books. How true is that? And I think this past year too, where we're sort of like all, sort of like global captives of this one condition, right? Of this one virus together that was affecting us similarly. We realized that, we realized that commonality. We realized that we are a global community. And of course there's so much optimism about how that can change our point of view, how we then see the world, that like we'll be more compassionate. That's not happened so much here, but maybe in other places. But we are communal histories, communal books. I think it's something that, human beings need to be reminded now and then. I think it's a very powerful lesson to learn. But I also, on the flip side of it, laugh at myself a little bit, because I remember, we often talk about mountains in Haiti, because your family migrated to Haiti, to a rather mountainous place. I remember I was visiting one of my aunts once in the mountains, and I was, and I saw the grave of my grandfather, my great grandfather, which was this, like, on this plot. And I'm standing there, and I said to my aunt, who was quite old and was one of the people who decided to stay on the mountain and not even to the city, not even to Port-au-Prince. She just stayed on the family homestead. And I said to her, I want my ashes to be spread here, when I'm dead. And then she said, we have enough dust here, like, just get buried where you die. So there's also the sort of a lack of control we have over these situations to be acknowledged. But it's a passage that I love so much, which is why I wanted it also at the beginning with the Toni Morrison epigraph, which is also, she also has a powerful reflection on mortality and language, where she said, we die, that may be the meaning of our lives. When we do language, that is the measure of our lives.
For the listeners now, the viewers now, what you mentioned is quite surprisingly, I suppose, it was a very small Jewish community that left Europe and ended up living in Haiti. I think 107 Jewish families were in Haiti, and there was only a very small Jewish community that existed before, mainly of Syrian Jews. And my parents met in Haiti in 1941. My mother was 16, my father was 21. They got married 3 years later and were married for 71 years. But my father was a farmer on the hills of Port-au-Prince, a little bit above, in a place called Kenskoff. And one of my greatest dreams, Edwidge, which you know because I repeat it often, is to go to Haiti with you when the opportunity comes, and on the trace of my father, but also on the trace of our past and where we come from and what we have. That's what's so powerful of the Ondaatje, what we have swallowed, all the stories we know and all the stories that were told to you. And this brings me to this notion of the writer as witness. The writer as witness, and the writer, what do you have to testify to? And I'm always reminded, because I'm a quotomaniac by profession, I'm always reminded of this wonderful line of Primo Levi, very sobering line, and I'm wondering how it sits with you, where he says, "I have deliberately assumed the calm and sober language of the witness, not the lamenting tones of the victim or the irate voice of someone who seeks revenge."
I'm not a quote maniac like you, but this is one of those quotes that this is one of those that I feel like I remember, then I forget, I remember, then I forget. And I'm so grateful for you, to you, for reminding me. I think absolutely. I think they're different registers, right? And of course, who bears greater witness, even with his life and death in Primo Levi, right? To such horror. But the question you ask is also similar to, there was a 1984 interview with the writer James Baldwin. And another writer, Julius Lester, asked him, "What are you bearing witness to?" And he basically said, "To who I am, to where I am." And these are sort of, we're all living through, again, together, through these extraordinary times, right? And whenever that happens, I think we do look to artists to bear witness to it, to kind of help us make sense of it. We have the news that's giving us the numbers. We'll have the historians, right, who will give us the background and the framing. But the artists, I think, will individualize. They will bear witness in their own way. And also, in our tradition, like the Caribbean tradition, Latin American tradition, we have testimonial, right? Which is another kind of bearing of witness, like bearing testimony, and just kind of having
tell me
it
more
there.
about that. Tell me more about that.
The testimony, in the sense that of hearing from individual voices, right? And I think it's mixed. You mix it with our tradition of oral history, and so it's something that in my own life, for example, I've tried to tell my children. I have a 16-year-old and a 12-year-old. And I said to them, you are living right now through these most unprecedented times. Keep a journal, keep a diary. And they said to me, it's all on Instagram. They said it will be on Instagram. And in some ways they're right, because I feel like historians will be looking at TikToks from this era as part of our testimonial. But that this kind of,
what is missing though? What is missing though there?
I mean, what is missing? Of course, I am. You and I have a certain bias, right? Because we operate in a certain way. But I think there will be hints from what they're doing, and there will be plenty of literature as well. I think, after September 11, 2001, right, with the World Trade Center attacks, people were saying, oh, they wanted a 9/11 novel. They wanted, but what we saw first was, of course, the journalism, then the poetry, then gradually we got into these other forms. But I think everyone will bear witness in their own way. And we have, especially with sort of the social media, we have these tools that we don't have before. But I think nothing matches, sort of like the fully felt, that's why people are still reading the Decameron, right? For example, because there's a depth to literature, to like digging into an experience that carries across time. That's why the plague, Albert Camus' The Plague, was
which you reread in this time.
Yes, I did, and I was so surprised by sort of the patterns of how we with Dr. Rieu initially, it's like, this is not real, like nobody believes, sort of like the stages of grief in a pandemic in a way, and also the brilliance of Camus, I think, and just how timely that book felt, in that moment in time. Last year at this time.
I was so amazed in the early days of the pandemic, about a year and a half ago, the Italian publishers running out of copies because 60,000 copies of La Peste had been sold. So people do turn to literature. I don't know if they turn to it as a form of solace, but certainly as a way of better grasping the reality, which is so painful that people are living through. And then the flip side of that, speaking to Edwidge Candicat, the writer, is you as a writer being a witness. And I'm reminded of this line of Alejandra Pizarnik, where she says, I write to ward off fear and the clawing wind that lodges in my throat. And I would ask Edwidge, do you write to ward off fear? Why do you feel you have the urgency to commemorate, for instance, this moment?
Well, I do it. I feel the urgency to commemorate it first for myself. And I realized even, after this year, for the world, certainly with the pandemic, this year for IT, with the assassination of the president, an earthquake, a tropical storm, I see just in general, like humans, we want to move on, right? And at the end of La Peste, of the plague, Dr. Rieu is saying, he's saying they have a big party, right? At the end of the novel, they have a big party. And he's the only one ruminating. He's like, the plague will go dormant, right? And then reemerge when we least expect it. And I think we tend as human beings, like collectively and sometimes individually, to have short memories. So for me, it's just personally for me, like I don't want to forget certain things. And so for me to document it is important, just personally, for me, for my family. And then I think as part of like contributing testimonial again to the larger story, because ultimately something will be written as though it's true for all of us. And if there's not enough of voices, like if we don't include the story of, the police, also the racial year, that the pandemic of racism with George Floyd, the foot on his neck, and the way the world, people in Europe, people in Africa, people all over the world were reacting to that. I think if we don't have enough individual voices that document having experienced that, then there might be, for whatever reason in the future, some other history written in which we're not part of. So I think part of documenting what it was like in Little Haiti, where I live, where people lost their jobs, which then affects whether they could send money home to relatives in Haiti. Like, I feel like documenting all that contributes to the larger story that might otherwise be neglected.
So it's documenting, it's making sense of reality by writing, and it's also this, what you were mentioning, Toni Morrison. It's a form of remembering. Literally, the word remembering means putting back the members together. Right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so there is a notion of collecting the stories and gathering them in for future generations. When I always remember the Christopher Hitchens saying that one writes as if posthumously, one writes for the next generation to find out what we're doing. And it goes back to the ondaatje, what we swallow. So what have you been swallowing recently, Edwidge? What are the places? What do you go to help you make sense of this moment, which seems so hard to even understand?
Well, I mean, I've been, I guess, swallowing other writers, reading. I think, for example, Zadie Smith's book Intimations did such a beautiful job of documenting the moment, and she made a very powerful point in that book about suddenly writers, right? We are used to isolation. We're used to locking ourselves in. Most of us, not, there are some, but we're used to doing this sort of solitary work alone. But suddenly we were like everybody else, like wanting to have something to do, and both, that individual work and then sort of like the communal work that was demanded of a lot of us. So reading, I mean, and going back again and reading, reading Toni Morrison, reading other writers, and reading new, younger writers as well. And a lot of it, just like logistically, I had 2 children at home. I was doing like what a lot of parents were doing, like doing the Zoom school, and trying to keep that going, and trying to keep my my children's spirit. And also there was a lot happening with our family's members in Haiti, even though, the coronavirus wasn't, the numbers weren't as high there, but there were other issues. So just really, I mean, I was very dramatic, I think, about when I was asked that question during the pandemic era, because I knew so many people who had lost loved ones. I would just say, when people would say, "How are you doing?" I would just say, "I'm just trying to stay alive." Like, so, and I, and I would say that to those sort of people who were bold, and they were like, "Let's have coffee." I'm like, "No, I'm trying to stay alive." And so I think part of that, like feeling suddenly that fragility of life, made the art, sometimes it made it seem a little futile, but other times also like, oh, I better say the things I want to say. I better create the things I want to create. I better do the things I want to do. It's like Annie Dillard, an American writer, wrote in a book called The Writing Life. She said, this note, she said, to write as though this were your last words, like always. Like she talks to writers, she wants writers to create in that way. And then she also says to write as though you're writing for, quote, terminal patients, because that is, after all, the case, generally, not just even in the pandemic, but you could.
For all of us.
Yes, exactly.
All of us. I always remember my mother saying that living is dangerous and the outcome is always fatal.
Yeah, your mother was a wise woman. I mean,
and Adrian Rich saying, write work because the conditions are always terrible.
Yeah. And there is an urgency, I think, for people who who do this, and you realize that, like I realized that very early in my life, that it's like, I am going to write whether people read it or not. I'm going to write whether it's like, I knew that I would always be writing, whether it was just then to write and put in my, under my bed, because there was a kind of a need. I felt like such an urgent need to do it, that in some ways you can't really explain, but it's just kind of that was almost aligned with, as if it were my personality. And that's how I knew, my parents, being the children of immigrants, they wanted me to be a doctor. On his deathbed, my father looked up at me and said, "I'm not going to have a doctor in the family." Like, so, and my books had been published then. So that there was that, the pull and tug of it early on, but I always knew that whether I was a doctor or not, I would still be writing. So there's also, I think, that unexplainable drive to do it, and people who really love their like, who are it's almost like a mysterious ailment, that that it feels like,
from which you wish no cure.
Exactly, absolutely. That is the distinction, indeed.
I don't know how much you want to talk about this, but I do want to ask you, what of Haiti now, and what is happening on your island, and what I mean, given the vacuum of power and the overtaking of power, what maybe even this administration, which is so conflicted and certainly not clear, what are your, I hate using the word hopes, but what do you think, if you had to advise, what would you advise?
Well, I think Haiti, because Haiti might be not in the everyday thought of this particular audience, but is a very a small place, relatively to a large place in the Caribbean, that was born out of revolution. 1804, Haiti was the first place in the world where enslaved people overcame the European powers, especially France, and created their own nation. And from that moment has never really been, has been punished for it, frankly. The US, the United States, isolated, because all the countries, including the US around, were slave owning, and Haiti was a bad example. And from that isolation and having to pay France for its independence, having to pay for decades for that, and even having the indigenous population killed by the Spaniards. I'm sorry, but that is the truth of history. But it's just a very long haul for Haiti with the U.S. occupations. And so now, having had the assassination of the president, the earthquake, and recent events, and people who are coming now to the border, not directly from Haiti, but people who had left during after the earthquake in 2010, who, along with other migrants, Venezuelans, Cubans, and some migrants as far as the continent of Africa, who are crossing 10 countries sometimes through the Darien Gap to get to the U.S. Mexico border. So it's a very difficult time in Haiti right now, but there are people in Haiti who are putting themselves together, who want to try a new path. Now, the obstacle is always, the larger powers who are like, we know what's better for you, we know this, and so, but there are my hope, as you were saying, my hope is that there are a lot more young people who are engaged in the political process. There are a lot of more civil society people who want to see the country take a different path, but they often come against really large powers who have very different interests than than the people on the ground who then end up suffering for that. So my hope is in the people of Haiti. They want to, people who want to, lead their country, like who want to create a better future for their people. My hope is in them and will always be.
Autonomy, I mean, it seems that Haiti is so rarely granted autonomy.
Absolutely. And for some reason, every time Haitians express their desire or vote for someone or want to be allowed to vote for someone who wants to go in that direction, they're squashed. And then it's sort of like a cycle begins again, which it seems like where the US policy wants to keep Haiti, because they sort of keep recycling the same people as their representative. And they have a lot of power in the region, and they especially have a lot of power in Haiti, and certainly in enforcing their wills on Haitians.
Edwidge, in closing, I want to leave you with a reaction you had to Junot Diaz, which I absolutely love. And I'd love you to riff on it as if you were a jazz musician. Riff on your own reaction to his comment. I will read his question and see if you remember how you answered. It's just marvelous. He said, Junot Diaz said, "The Caribbean is a cradle of African diasporic genius. When you are away, what do you miss?" Do you remember what you answered?
Oh, I remember the question, which is a wonderful question and so important to remember. I think I said humor.
You said laughter.
Laughter, yes.
So riff on that.
Laughter, because I feel like that's one of our survival skills. Like, I remember being in tap-taps in Haiti, sometimes at very difficult moments, and the jokes, the tap-tap and the jokes, and the double entendres of humor, of the proverbs, of just the way people tease each other, taquiner, laughter. It's sort of like not how people see us in the midst of all these tragedies, but there's even a whole literary genre called audience, which is just about satire and laughter. So yes, laughter. We all need a lot more. We all need a bit of that in our lives, of course, wherever we are. These are very difficult times in the world. So laughter and humor are just as crucial, I think, as witnessing.
But that is what you miss when you're away from Haiti. That's what I found so powerful is, there Junot Diaz is asking this really substantial question, and you answer in an equally substantial way. What you miss is the laughter despite the tragedy, despite what you're witnessing. As harsh as it is.
Yeah, that's what I've found, like at least in my family with my folks. I feel like that's helped a lot. That's helped a lot in terms of coping, and that's also features a lot in the art. This sort of sometimes vaudevillian humor, just the beauty. I think it's underestimated, and it's something that in my work I find hard to do, but I think that in Junot's work he does. I think that it's the beauty and the power of laughter and is sometimes very underestimated, but it's something that is very
important. And laughter is so important as a form of resistance against dictatorship.
Absolutely. And a form of resistance against just the world's constant desire to destroy you.
On this joyous note, Edwidge, it's been a real pleasure to speak with you. I can't wait when we can speak in person, but I'm very happy we could speak this way. And to all the Madrileños, muchísimas gracias. Thank you so much for inviting us. Yes, I'm very, very pleased to be having this moment. I feel that one of the pleasures, if there's any silver lining to this pandemic at all, is these moments where we travel, even if virtually. It's better than not traveling at all, and it's been wonderful to share this moment with Edwidge and with all those present around the world watching this, and those in Madrid who have hosted us. Thank you very much for your kindness.
Thank you. Gracias.
Muchas gracias. Bye bye.